Okay, I'm ready when you are.
Yep, just waiting for the live stream to start. We don't want anybody to miss anything. Sometimes it takes a minute just to warm up. Okay, there we go. Well, welcome everyone to another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. Tonight is especially exciting for us because we get to platform one of our own. In Jeff Klein, who's a longtime board member and activist at Massachusetts Peace Action. He's also a leader of Dorchester People for Peace. So it's great to be able to put forward one of our own to talk about his direct experience visiting the Middle East. Jeff, over the years, has gone to the Middle East many, many times, and he's kind enough generally to do a report call, to do a talk, whether in person or on Zoom, to our members and our supporters and everyone we can reach about what he's seen. Because as we know, if you're only reading the mainstream media or watching mainstream news, you're not going to get the real picture of what's going on in the Middle East. So we thank him for doing so, and I welcome what's going on, everybody in the Middle East. 1 second, little background noise there. But we want to welcome everyone to direct from the Middle East, observations from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria with Jeff Klein. As I said, Jeff Klein's a longtime board member of Massachusetts Peace Action. And also a leader with Dorchester People for Peace. He's a retired machinist and local trade union president, so he's got a good labor background. And since the early 2000s, 2003 or 2004, Jeff has been traveling almost every year to Palestine and Israel when there's not a worldwide pandemic to contend with. But he was just on a very, very long trip to Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. Sounds grueling, but like a great trip. So I'm interested in hearing a lot more. And without further ado, I'm going to give you over to Jeff Klein.
Thanks, Brian. It was grueling. I guess that's a good name for it. I was on the road for a total of about 6 weeks, and it's hot this time of year, and I'm not as young as I used to be, like a lot of us. So I'm still recovering. I've been home for a week, but I'm still kind of recovering mentally and physically. But the trip was very worthwhile. In fact, even despite, as Brian said, despite the many times I visited the region over the years, there's always something new to learn. And particularly on this trip, there was a lot that was new to me that I'll try to express. So let me go to the screen sharing, and because I'm going to show you some maps and other things that'll hopefully help provide some background. And so let's see how this works.
Here we go. I'm seeing it.
Okay. All right. Good. So as Brian said, I spent over a month in the Middle East between Palestine-Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, about equally divided. And that followed a week with my kids in Greece beforehand. So it was a long and sort of taxing journey. And, there were a lot of anecdotes I could give and I could do a kind of travelogue, but I'm hoping to do something a little more coherent, which is not easy considering we're talking about 3 countries, which are distinct in various ways, but they're also tied together, very organically in terms of the politics of the Middle East and their own sort of culture and history. So it's not just 3 random countries, it's 3 countries that share a common culture, common history, and of course, a common target from the United States and its allies. Lebanon has had, depending on how you count it, 3 or 4 wars against it from Israel. Syria is bombed at least weekly by Israel, and In the earlier years of the war in Syria, the Israelis gave material support to the anti-government jihadist rebels that were operating near their occupied Golan Heights. And of course, Israel is the prime oppressor of its own Palestinian population under its control. And of course, all of this is highlighted by the fact that, the U.S. has had a hand in every one of these countries very, very deeply, both historically and now, and highlighted by the fact that Joe Biden is in Israel right now, I think, or on his way. I don't know if he's landed yet. And that sort of highlights the close political, military, and policy alignment of the U.S. and Israel, and then secondhand how that plays out against the neighbors of Israel and against the Palestinians. But in fact, these three countries have more than just geographical proximity in common. In fact, there's a long history. This whole region, which we could loosely call the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, was historically one cultural and political area up until about 100 years ago. It was known as the Bilad Sham. Sham is the sort of popular name for the city of Damascus, and sometimes it's called Greater Syria. But all of the countries that grew out of this sort of unified cultural and geographical territory spoke a very similar dialect of Arabic, in contrast to Egypt and the Saudi Peninsula. They shared a common trajectory of almost 100% Arabic speakers, but divided up between Muslims and Christians and various Muslim sects and various Christian sects, so that this area was a kind of cultural mosaic that existed long before modern times, and for many years belonged to the Ottoman Empire from about the 400 years before the First World War, a century ago. This entire area was part of the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century, but recognized as a sort of particular area within that. And even though the Ottoman Empire ruled out of Constantinople, Istanbul was primarily Turkish-speaking in its ruling class. The Arab-speaking world in the Middle East, had a significant amount of sort of cultural, autonomy and local rule that was, unencumbered by the overall Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was, let me go back to this, was at its peak very, very big. You can see it included, a big chunk of what we call the Balkans today, what is now modern Turkey, both shores of the Arab Peninsula, and all of the various parts of North Africa that we see here. But, starting, in the last couple of 100 years, it lagged behind the European powers in sort of modernization and its military capacity, so that gradually in the 19th and early 20th century, most of its territory was bitten away by the various European colonial powers, the French in Morocco and Algeria, the Italians in Libya, the British in Egypt and Sudan, so that on the eve of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was reduced to this core of what's now Turkey and the shores of the Arabian Peninsula. And during the First World War, the British first promised that the Arabs, as part of the Ottoman Empire, would have an independent state if they joined the Allies against the Ottomans and the Germans, which they did. But at the same time, shortly afterwards, secretly, they signed an agreement with the French to divide up the same territories that they had promised as independent states to the Arabs. And this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement in May 1916, which was secret. And it was only made public, embarrassingly, for the Allies after the Russian Revolution. Russia was originally part of this deal. The Russians, after the revolution, published the protocol that showed that the British and French were betraying their commitments to the Arabs. And so this was the British and French war aims at the end of the war, in which they carried out with slight modifications. And this is one of those things in history that's sort of so unbelievable that it beggars fiction. So let me just show you again this map. This was the original dividing up. The French were going to get this blue and gray part. The British were going to get this yellow and red part. And the Holy Land was going to be jointly ruled by the Allied powers because it was religiously important for all of them. Instead, with the Russians out of the picture, the British and French leaders met informally in London just after the end of the war and had this conversation, which was actually recorded. So it was George Clemenceau, the leader of France, and David Lloyd George, the prime minister of Britain. And Clemenceau asked George, now given the victory, what do you want? And he said Mosul. Mosul, which is now the northern part of Iraq, was originally supposed to be in the French zone, part of French Syria. And Clemenceau said, okay, what else do you want? And Lloyd George famously, with a lot of destiny, said Palestine. And Clemenceau said, okay, you can have that too. And that laid the foundation for the Middle East as we know it today. Sorry, I'm something. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is the model Middle East as we know it, whose borders were basically determined, secretly between the British and French. And one consequence was that this large zone, what had been Greater Syria, was divided up into half a dozen smaller countries: Lebanon, British Mandate Palestine, Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria. And part of this area was ultimately given over to Turkey, even though culturally and linguistically it was really part of this sort of Greater Syria. And just as a reminder, it's not only the Middle East that was decisively shaped by colonialism, but the entire world that we inhabit is really a consequence of 19th and 20th century colonialism. I mean, obviously, if you think about it for a minute, I'm speaking from Boston, which is a major city of a successful settler colonial state, allied with former imperial powers and other settler colonial states like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These successful ones were able to sort of demographically overwhelm the native people and militarily repress them so that they became permanent in effect. Elsewhere, we might remember that not all of these settler colonial efforts are successful. The French ruled Algeria for 130 years and ultimately were thrown out by an independence movement. And of course, colonial apartheid South Africa was ultimately transformed into a majority rule democratic state after hundreds of years of British and Afrikaner colonialism. And of course, if you look at a map anywhere, including this one, the borders, especially in Africa, are those that were set by the colonial powers. And even in the Middle East, besides these countries that were invented by the British and French, the smaller countries around the Persian Gulf were also creations of the British, in effect. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates were all originally British protectorates. So the legacy of colonialism is still very, very vital in the Middle East. And you can't understand the Middle East today, or our world today for that matter, without knowing something about the colonial background. So here's a little summary of the trip. And I guess this map shows this area circled in red called the Levant. It's a common term, but it's also sort of a colonial term. It means the East. It means the Orient, in effect, in Italian. And so it's like the Middle East, like the term Middle East itself. Levant is a kind of colonial construct, but it's still in common usage. And again, it's another way of looking at what was once Greater Syria, this eastern shore of the Mediterranean, between southern Turkey and the Nile, the Suez Canal, actually. So I started out in Athens, flew to Ben Gurion Airport in Lid near Tel Aviv, and then spent a couple of weeks in Palestine and Israel, 10 days or so in Lebanon, and 10 days or so in Syria. And it's a little complicated getting around between these places. Of course, Lebanon and Syria are technically still at war with Israel, so you can't go directly from one to the other. So further complicating what was already a tiring itinerary, I had to fly from Tel Aviv to Cyprus, and then from Cyprus to Beirut. That's the only way to get. The other way is to go, which is also really tiring, to go to Jordan through the Allenby Bridge, and which is a very nightmarish and hard way to go. So this was the first time I went that way. So buying separate tickets, one to Cyprus and separately one to Beirut. So I left Athens on May 28th, and as usual, I stayed in the old city of Jerusalem at this hotel called Hashimi, which is notable because from the roof, it has the best view in Jerusalem. And this is from the roof of that hotel. But unexpectedly, scheduled the same day for my arrival in Jerusalem was the reconstituted annual Flag Day March in the old city. It had been suspended the year before because tensions were very high with Hamas, and there was Israeli bombing in Gaza, and there was a lot of fear that this would be too provocative. But it was reinstated this year by the right-wing government of Israel, by one of the right-wing governments of Israel. So right below the hotel where I stayed was this raucous mob march through the largely Muslim part of the old city, which I wrote about. If some of you saw, I mean, to me, of course, I had some experience with Zionism for many years and right-wing Zionism, even, but this was a step beyond that. This was literally had a very fascist flavor to it. And you can get, I think this picture can show you, can give you some sense of it. They intentionally marched through the Damascus Gate and through the main thoroughfare of the Muslim quarter of the city. Like this, you can see flags, mostly young people, protected by a large presence of Israeli border police and soldiers. And it really was, the intent was not so much political expression as a kind of warning and intimidation to the Arab inhabitants of the old city, with the message, in effect, that this city belongs to us and not to you, even though you happen to be living here. So I'll just show you a few pictures so you can get the flavor of it. The soldiers were not only keeping order, but they were actively participating in the march in different places. And they particularly gathered where there was some place that was symbolic, like a mosque, to sort of demonstrate, and yell obscenities about the Muslim religion and about Muslims, and death to the Arabs was one of their calls. And you can see marching in front of what to me was a very well-known Arab Palestinian restaurant. You can get a flavor for the different tribes of the Israeli far right. You have settlers. This is kind of a female settler uniform. You have the large woven knit caps that belong mostly to the settler youth, and the tiny little kippah of that Bennett's ultra-nationalist right-wing movement. Most of these youth came from religious schools in Greater Jerusalem, and again, they were young. And on the way, besides intimidating the Arab residents, they sometimes defaced. This is a very famous Arab sweet shop, which was defaced with a Jewish star. And again, you can get a flavor for this. It was a pretty terrifying thing to witness. And of course, I was in no danger. I was a sort of anonymous tourist, and not obviously Palestinian, but obviously any Palestinian who found their way in the middle of this crowd was in danger, and many were beaten up along the way, although only Palestinians were arrested. No Jewish Flag Day demonstrators were arrested by the police. And outside of the march, even though in theory the police were meant to keep the march on this route, this narrow route, they also protected, other people who wanted to show the flag elsewhere within the, off the route. And this is also a typical scene of a sort of settler family, right? You can see from the headdress of the woman, and he would be wearing a knit cap, and a lot of children in tow, which is in the far right, the nationalist right in Israel. Having children is not just a family issue; it's a political issue. So this was, an unusual welcome to Jerusalem, I have to say, even in my experience. And just to show you the rest of my route from Jerusalem, I went to Ramallah and then Nablus, in both places which I had friends that I, see regularly. And then from Nablus to Tulkarm, and then crossed the border, what used to be the Green Line border, to a town called Kalansawa inside Israel, which is 100% inhabited by Palestinian citizens of Israel, that I've also been visiting for many years. And then ultimately made my way to Bethlehem, which I'll describe a little bit later in a little bit more detail, in connection with a political, cultural organization and an organization in one of the refugee camps in Bethlehem that's very meaningful. So looking at this map, just a reminder, most demographic scholars believe that even today, there's a Palestinian majority in the area controlled by Israel. Some Israelis or Zionists claim it's close to 50-50, but when you take into account the Jewish Israelis that are counted as citizens but don't live in Israel, I think it's pretty safe to say that there's a substantial Palestinian majority in this whole territory of historic Palestine that's ruled by and for Israeli Jews alone. But they're not all the same. All Palestinians are not the same. They have very different statuses. The 2 million or so Palestinians who have historically lived within the borders of Israel before 1967 are nominally citizens, although everybody understands that they are far from equal citizens in a state that is officially the state of the Jews, not the state of all the people who happen to live there. Then you have, at the lowest end, you have the people in Gaza, again, 2 million or so, who are basically kept in prison by the Israelis and can't come or go or have anything come or go to them without Israeli permission. And then you have in Jerusalem, you have several 100,000 Palestinians who are allowed to live there without being citizens of Israel, even though Israel has annexed the whole city. They're allowed to live there, effectively green card holders. And then the rest, around 3 million Palestinians, live in what we know as the occupied West Bank, who have no rights whatsoever. I mean, nominally, they have a right to be ruled by the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority is more of a fiction than a reality. So this will give us another view of the same thing. This is the West Bank. What's shown in gray is what's called Area C under the Oslo Accords, which is the majority, about 60% of the West Bank. The darker color, Area A, is nominally under Palestinian Authority control, and the lighter beige is under Palestinian civic control, but Israeli military control. And within this, Palestinians are trying to survive with varying degrees of success, particularly in Area C. There's a huge amount of pressure on the Palestinians that live there to get out or to make life intolerable for them one way or another. And it varies from place to place. I mean, the cities, people are sort of making do, many of them with jobs that have to do with the Palestinian Authority or foreign NGOs. But in the rest of the Area C, there's a huge amount of pressure on people that makes their daily life nearly unbearable. So this is a view of Bethlehem, for example. And you can see how crowded it is. The wall, Bethlehem is surrounded almost completely by the Israeli apartheid or separation wall. This illustrates how it's organized, right? It's built up as close as possible to sort of densely inhabited Palestinian areas to leave as much open land on the sort of Israeli side of the wall for future expansion, and making it difficult for Palestinians to build or to find space to live and build. And this is where there are several refugee camps in Bethlehem. The one that I spent time with was the Ida refugee camp, in which there's a program whose headquarters is in Greater Boston called One for Three that works with this organization. And I'm hoping Brian will put that link to that in the chat if you haven't already. And there's also another organization, Badil, which deals with sort of political questions of refugee rights and the right of return. And those two organizations operate kind of in tandem. IDA, the One for Three provides services in the refugee camp, but not just services, not just social service, but sort of politically and culturally pointed services. And one of their things is to develop independent urban agriculture on the roofs of their buildings, hydroponic agriculture. And again, this is not just charity. It has to do with inculcating a sense of self-reliance and independence from the sort of Israeli economy. And they also do things like have exercise classes and dance classes for women in the camp, again, imbued with a kind of political cultural message. It's not just social service. And with Badil, they work to help Palestinians that are under pressure in Area C to remain on the land. And they have several projects around that. This is the town of Batir, which is right next to the Green Line, about here. And of course, it's ringed by Israeli settlements. You can see on the hilltop here and all around. So it's struggling to survive. It's an old agricultural community. And One for Three and Badil give support to the ongoing sort of agricultural life in the community with financial support, irrigation, seeds, and technical support. And it's a great program. And I was able to visit there. And in the Jordan Valley, where some of the land is privately owned by Palestinians and there are historic Palestinian villages, there's also a huge pressure on them to deny them access to water and grazing lands and so on. And Badil and One for Three also work there to sort of enable Palestinians to survive on the land. Clearly, the plan of the Israelis is to sort of ethnically cleanse as much of the Palestinian population from Area C as they can. And ultimately, it has been effectively annexed, but ultimately, if there ever would be any kind of an ongoing independent Palestinian authority, it wouldn't have access to these lands. And this is one of the young women that works for Badil with one of their pamphlets, which I think is a good motto for us all. So after a couple of weeks in Palestine, I flew to Cyprus and then to Beirut. And just to give you a little bit of the idea of the geography, Beirut is not far from Damascus. It's a drive a couple of hours, basically. And Beirut has these two mountain ranges. And in between, the Bekaa Valley is kind of the breadbasket, the agricultural breadbasket of Lebanon. The south of Lebanon is primarily Shia Muslims. Beirut is mixed, sort of evenly divided between Shia and Sunni Muslims and Christians of various sects. And the Bekaa Valley is mostly also Shia Muslims. And this trip, I had some perspective on the Shia community in Lebanon, and particularly their association and support for the political and resistance organization Hezbollah, more than I had ever in the past. And it partly was by chance. Through a friend, I linked up with a guy, a very devout Shia Muslim guy, who worked part-time as a tour guide. And there wasn't much work. Lebanon is not receiving many tourists these days, neither is Syria. And in fact, the US advises Americans not to go to Lebanon, never mind Syria. I don't think it occurs to them to advise or not advise that Syria. It's just not thought that Americans go there. So my friend Rabi had some time, and we visited, some unusual things, and I learned a lot about the Shia community and Hezbollah, particularly, some of you, I don't know how much you know, and the Shia Muslims are a minority sect in most places in the Middle East. But they're also, because of their minority status and their history, they tend to be more easygoing culturally than at least the extremist Sunnis. And of course, these days, they're primarily tied and support Hezbollah, which is a religious organization and a resistance organization, resistance mainly against Israel in the United States. Lebanon and Syria have both suffered hugely from US economic sanctions, primarily directly on Syria, but a lot of it has spilled over into Lebanon too, so that the economies are really racked by very bad inflation, which has made life difficult for people. Historically, for many, many years, they were 1,500 Lebanese pounds to the dollar. Now it's pushing 30,000 to the dollar. And historically, there were 50 Syrian pounds to the dollar, and now they're about close to 4,000 Syrian pounds to the dollar. So inflation has really hurt people in the region. And among other things, it means everybody has to carry around anyone who has any money has to carry around these giant wads of cash, because there aren't, given the state of inflation, there aren't high denomination bills enough to, supply it. So this will give you an idea. What you're looking at here, which is, I don't know how much you can see, is many, many, many thousand Lebanese Syrian pounds and a million and some Lebanese pounds. It all adds up to about $70. And this is an old Syrian 500-pound note, which is now worth about 10 cents. So besides the economy being crushed by this economic collapse and US sanctions, electricity is very, very spotty in Lebanon. It has been in Lebanon for many years. And now in Syria, it's completely unreliable. And, electricity is no more than a few hours a day at most, although there are various ways of getting around this. Some people have private generators. There are local neighborhood networks that are based on generators. And most of the hotels seem to have their own generators and seem to have electricity. At least where I stayed in Beirut and Damascus, the hotels had electricity 24 hours a day, although it would kick out, the official electricity would kick out, and then there'd be a little delay before the generator went on. So anyway, back to the Shia and Hezbollah, I just want to illustrate sort of the dual nature as a religious movement and as a political resistance movement. And this is a picture of a shrine near Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley. It's a shrine dedicated to Khawla, who was the supposed daughter of Hussein, one of the founders of one of the imams that founded the Shia tendency within Islam. And Hussein and all the men were killed at a famous battle in Karbala in Iraq. And the women were all captured and taken away toward Damascus, where the winners were based. And supposedly Khawla, an infant daughter of Hussein, died in Baalbek on this journey. And they built, there was a shrine, a longstanding shrine there, which was recently sort of refurbished and expanded with Iranian money. And it's a pilgrimage place. Shia Islam is kind of like Catholicism compared to a Protestant Sunni Islam. There are a lot of saints in Shia Islam and pilgrimages and, besides the Hajj and holy places that are revered. The Sunnis don't have any truck with any of that. To them, it's idolatry. But anyway, there's this very busy shrine in Baalbek, but right next to the shrine is effectively a military museum of Hezbollah and run by the Islamic Resistance Support Organization, which is a very funny welcome sign. And it's, again, right next to the mosque is this military museum, that sort of commemorates the battles of Hezbollah against Israel, primarily. And this will give you a sense of how Hezbollah combines religion and resistance. This urges people to make contributions to the Hezbollah funds so that they can turn them into weapons against Israel. This is Imad Mughniya, one of the Hezbollah leaders that was assassinated by Israel 10 or so years ago. And also, they're tied in. It's not just resisting Israel and Lebanon, but the ideology of Hezbollah is very oriented toward solidarity with Palestinians and liberating Palestine. And so in this museum, there were a lot of these sort of dioramas and models. And this is one that shows the southern border area of Lebanon here in green. And this area, which is modern day Israel, is labeled Palestine. And this big arrow here says the way to Jerusalem, Quds in Arabic. This is the direction of Jerusalem. So it's both a religious movement and a resistance movement. And surprisingly, not all the people they revere are people we'd recognize as religious figures. So this was in the museum as well. This is Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current Bashir, who rules Syria. You recognize these guys. This is Gamal Abdel Nasser. And this guy, who maybe is obscure to you, is a hero of the resistance against Italian colonialism in Libya in the early decades of the 20th century. He's Omar al-Mukhtar, famous, legendary guerrilla fighter against the Italians. So not far from Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, the wheat harvest was just this, the winter wheat harvest was finishing, but there were lots of, it was very green with vegetables and vineyards and so on, and also marijuana plantations, which is what you're looking at here. And it's another sign about that, Hezbollah has a much more easygoing attitude than in terms of consuming intoxicants, both alcohol and hashish, which is a big industry in the Bekaa Valley. And I've visited this town many, many times over the year. And they, when I arrive, I'm always greeted with a polite hashish cigarette, and we chat. And I once asked, marijuana, hashish is the Arabic word for the plant, and also what we call hashish, the refined, sort of solid version of this. And it's nominally illegal in Lebanon still, but you can see it's growing very openly. This is not in the middle of the woods in Humboldt County in California. And I asked my friend there, who was, pretty much like all the people in this village involved on one level or another with this trade, whether they had to pay off people in the Lebanese government, to keep their marijuana plantation. And his response was, we're stronger than the government. And the we, in this case, may be the clan in this village, which is very militant, has a lot of fighters in it, or Hezbollah. But anyway, the government kind of doesn't crack down on this stuff. And it's still an important industry in the Bekaa Valley. So we also went to what's called South Lebanon along the border with Israel. And this is a pretty difficult place to visit. You need to get permission from the Lebanese security services, because this border area next to Israel, this is Israel, is a kind of no-go zone, supposedly policed by the UN. And you need to get special permission to go there, but we did get that permission. And the towns near the border some of them are very well known, especially people who follow the sort of military confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel. Particularly Bint Jbeil was a town only a few miles inside of Lebanon that the Israeli army was not able to conquer in the 2006 war, where Hezbollah effectively fought the Israelis to a standstill, still unique in the history of wars in the Middle East. And so this is a very famous and very renowned town. The other ones are also well known to people from the fighting. Israel occupied the southern part of Lebanon between 1982 and 2000, when they were effectively expelled by Hezbollah resistance. And then they attacked again in 2006 and were repelled again. So, and commemorating that, there's this pretty unique place. There's something like a theme park that's run by Hezbollah called Melita near this area in southern Lebanon, which commemorates basically what they view as the defeat of Israel. It's a kind of like military cross between a military memorial and a Disneyland kind of theme park. And this is there are all these exhibitions about destroyed Israeli tanks and so on from the various wars. And we spoke to, I hope to write this out. I had a long interview with someone who works there as a volunteer guide, who, Hezbollah is very, they're very careful about who they speak to, and they're very concerned with security because many of them have been assassinated by Israel. And just one little anecdote, when we sat down with this guy, I was with a friend of mine and this Lebanese guy that was our guide, And we were sort of chatting to try to break the ice a little bit. And, we were explaining we're not religious people, but we're leftists in the United States. And his response was, there's a left in the United States? So anyway, we broke the ice. He told us his story, which was very poignant, and I hope to write it up someday. But just to give you an idea, again, the highlands in Lebanon are right next to the border. This is the Israeli border wall in that area. This area beyond is the Hula Valley with Kiryat Shimona and Metula there. And these mountains beyond are the Golan Heights, and the other side of that is Damascus. So you can view this, and then different places in the wall, as in Palestine, have been used as canvases for sort of resistance art. And this is one that shows the wall, with a hole blown through it. And through the hole, you can see Jerusalem. And it says here in Arabic, the gates of return. And it shows here a Hezbollah fighter and a Palestinian fighter kind of joined as brothers. There's also in Maroun al-Ras, right on the border of Israel, a park that was financed by Iran, which, among other things, has this giant statue of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards that was assassinated by Trump. And he's on this tower pointing, this is Israel. And he's pointing, as return, that we'll get there someday. And, you probably have heard, martyrdom is a very big deal in Lebanese sort of political and religious culture. And in Beirut, there are two large martyr cemeteries that are indoors, actually. And this will give you a view of one of them. This is Imad Mughniya and his son Jihad. And I forget who this is, who are, regarded as some of the biggest heroes. And this is Jihad, who was also, Mughniya was assassinated in, I'm thinking 2010, something like that. And his son was killed a few years later fighting Israel. And the slogan at the top is, all of us for Jihad. And again, riding around Lebanon, you see martyrs everywhere. People that were killed in various battles with Israel, and also in some cases with in Syria, where Hezbollah sent a lot of soldiers to fight. And this is just very typical. You'll see a picture of a guy with his name and Hezbollah flags and so on. So there's a lot more to say, and I could do much more of the kind of travelogue stuff, but let me move on and try to finish up. So from Beirut, which is here, to Lebanon, you go to Damascus, you go overland. The border is pretty complicated to get through, and Americans basically cannot get visas to go to Syria. You need a visa to get to Syria. And I was able to get a visa through a connection with a Syrian American that I know locally who pulled some strings with the Syrian government. And people were amazed because there had been no American tourists in Syria for years and years. I was the first one practically. So people were quite surprised at it. So I spent about a week in Lebanon and 3 or 4 days in Aleppo, and drove back and forth to Aleppo through Homs, Hama, and so on this main highway. Syria is, I wouldn't say at peace, but there's no major combat going on right now. The government controls this sort of reddish area, which is most of the heavily populated part of Syria, which especially runs on this line here. The U.S. has a big base on the border of Syria and Jordan, and protects there some Syrian opposition fighters that occasionally launch attacks from this area. The U.S. also has smaller bases throughout this yellow area, which is jointly controlled by the U.S. and its Kurdish allies. The green here is occupied by Turkey. Everybody has got a piece of something in Syria. And this darker green is what's left of the sort of Al-Qaeda, ISIS-controlled territory in Syria. The last major fighting took place in 2019, 2020, in which the Syrians and the Russians got a piece of this, what had been Idlib province, and opened the direct road for the first time to Aleppo. Before that, you had to go a sort of roundabout way to get to Aleppo. So there are tens of thousands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters in this area, protected by Turkey, in effect, and supplied by the UN. It's a very untenable situation in the long run, but it's kind of frozen for the time being. And the fact that there's no major combat going on now, generally, since the last time I was in Syria was 2018, the atmosphere was considerably more relaxed. I mean, obviously, given that the country is partially occupied by several foreign powers, it's not that there's peace, but in the main cities, there's a kind of, the war is kind of on hold, and rather than sort of, really threatening to break out on a large scale. Turkey is now threatening to reinvade the Kurdish occupied parts of Syria, and that may happen soon, and nobody knows what that will open up if that happens. So the U.S. and Turkey, which is a NATO country, and their allies are still occupying part of Syria. And this part of Syria in particular is the breadbasket, the wheat breadbasket of Syria, literally, and has a lot of the oil and gas reserves. So the U.S. is denying those resources to the central government of Syria. And as a result, there's a shortage of wheat. Besides the inflation, life is very hard for ordinary people in Syria. And because they lack the fuel, people have to fuel for vehicles and for generators is hard to come by. There are lines at gas stations a mile long sometimes. They smuggle gas from Lebanon. You can still get gas in Lebanon, although the price is very high. So this is kind of the situation. And just as an illustration, when we took this road, this was the second time I went to Aleppo. It's a long, long road over the whole length of Syria. And given that it's still wartime, there are many military checkpoints along this road. But the mood at these checkpoints was much more relaxed than it had been. And a lot of the checking and the security was kind of perfunctory. And I had this incident, which I've written about, but it was very touching to me. At the last checkpoint before Aleppo, we were stopped by some soldiers at the checkpoint, and they questioned who was who. And when they heard I was an American, which, is a very rare bird in Syria these days, they asked us to get out of the car and come with them. And, it's a little tense. It turned out they wanted us to drink mate with them. Mate is yerba buena. It's a custom to drink it. It's a kind of a mint and other herbs that are soaked in hot water and drunken through these metal straws. It's very prevalent in Argentina and Uruguay. And because a lot of Syrians spent time in South America, they kind of brought this custom back with them. So that was it. They wanted to celebrate us, and they were so happy to meet an American, which was very, very touching. And we smoked water pipe, and they shared their lunch with us. So this was an example of, that security is much more relaxed than it used to be. On the way to Aleppo, by the way, some place many of you may not have heard of is a little town called Maalula. It's in a sort of mountain pass just north of Damascus. And this is a village that is inhabited by speakers of Aramaic, which is an ancient Semitic language from that survives from biblical times. And it was taken over by ISIS and Al-Qaeda in 2013. A lot of atrocities were committed. Nuns were kidnapped and raped, and it was retaken by the army with a pretty serious battle. This hotel, former tourist hotel above the town, was the headquarters of Al-Qaeda in this town, and there was fierce fighting there to liberate it. And eventually, the nuns who had been kidnapped were ransomed by the Syrian government and brought back. So on the way to Aleppo, we passed through Homs, which was also the scene of very heavy fighting, and a lot of it is still evident. This is a neighborhood near the one of the famous mosques in Homs, which has been rebuilt, but you can see the results of the fighting. But they're also rebuilding. This is the old souk, the old market, which was very badly destroyed and has now been pretty much restored. And Aleppo, which again, the average American thinks was besieged and destroyed by the Syrian army, of course, most of the city it was pretty unscathed by the fighting, particularly the modern part of the city. And this is a view from the hotel I stayed at, Al Jabri Square here, and you can see, the dense population of Aleppo. The most of the fighting and the damage was in the old part of the city and the old markets, and a lot of that's being cleared and restored now. This is a neighborhood called Jadeda, which means the new neighborhood. And of course, it's new in the sense that it was built in the 15th and 16th century, as opposed to the oldest parts of Aleppo. But the war still has its effects. While I was at the hotel, there was a family there in town to get medical care for their two children. There were three children originally. One of them stepped on a mine in a field just outside of town. She was killed, and this son, Ahmed, age 3, and Dalal, age 7, each lost a leg there, and they were in town to get prosthetic limbs. So it's a reminder that even when U.S. wars wind down, the damage continues for a long time. People are still dying in Vietnam from stepping on mines and munitions, and of course will be for decades going forward in Afghanistan. So I just want to end with this. Syria exists. We can discuss if people want, the political situation there, which is not ideal from the point of view of democracy. But most Syrians I knew, to one degree or another, either accepted or reluctantly supported the government as their main defense against the collapse of the state and victory by, extreme Muslim fanatics. And this is a sign you saw around, Syrian English letters, and Syria, hey, my beloved, in Arabic. So I'll stop there. I could do a million more pictures, but I want to give some people a chance to ask some questions, and hopefully Brian put the links to look up, One for Three and Badil, two very worthy organizations, and particularly One for Three, locally based, is well worth supporting in whatever way you can. So sorry to take so long, but
that was a big trip, Jeff.
Yeah. So I'm happy if people want to hang on for discussion and questions. I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah, before we do, I just want to let people know, once again, you can either put your question in the chat and I'll read it off for you, or you can raise your hand and I'll put you up on screen and you can ask Jeff directly. But before we get into that, Jeff, could you give one more plug for the two links that you shared? I want to put them in the chat again.
So One for Three is a charity, a charity, officially a U.S.-based charity that funds a lot of the activities in the Aida refugee camp. And it's led by locally by Nidal Azraq, who some of you know, who's a great guy and a dear friend of mine. And they do great work. Badil is more overtly political. They're both political. They work as partners. Badil is a kind of a think tank, more of a think tank, and they work very closely with One for Three in the Aida camp, and also an organization that's worth getting to know about. They have a lot. They have a lot of publications and a lot of seminars and so on at their website on issues of Palestinian rights and the right of return. So two really terrific organizations that I highly recommend people support.
And just to let people know, I will be including those links in a follow-up email, and I encourage you as well to check out these organizations and support them. And thanks for your questions that are coming in the chat. But first, I just wanted to ask you one thing that struck me on one of the first slides that you showed us of the right-wing Israelis on their march. It reminded me of some of the right-wing marches that we've seen here in the United States, especially recently. I don't know if you saw, Jeff, over the July 4th weekend, there were some right-wingers marching around Boston, and also some accusations that the police were protecting them as well. Can you relate sort of these right-wing movements in Israel and the United States?
Yeah. So It's one of these peculiarities in the sort of world politics is that the far right in the United States and other countries, has its roots or its active ideology, which is anti-Jewish, which hates Jews, they love Israel at the same time, and Israel cultivates that love reciprocally, and because they recognize in Israel a sort of ethno state that they aspire to in the United States or France or Hungary, a sort of white Christian state. Somehow the Jews beat them to the punch of creating a Jewish ethno state before they were able to do it. So the spirit of this march, again, it's hard to convey. It was fascist. It definitely had that same spirit. And Amira Haas, a very good left-wing Israeli journalist, calls them, the Nazis were the brown shirts, the Italians were the black shirts. She calls this movement in Israel the white shirts, which is, if you remember seeing the picture, that's their kind of uniform. And it's fascism. It's not just Zionism. It's not just right wing. It's fascism. And that's not everybody, but it's a very substantial stream within Israeli politics. And it points out, if you remember seeing those pictures, that crowd was predominantly young, high school, college students, teenagers, young adults. And it's a very peculiar phenomenon, maybe the only place in the world where young people are more right wing than their parents. Traditionally, right, young people are sort of left wing, and maybe they become more conservative as they grow older. In Israel, the new generation is more to the right than their parents. And it points out this issue that if anyone has any illusions about change from within Israel, forget about it. Israel will not change in a good direction on its own from any internal, political struggle. Basically, the moderate Zionists are a small minority within Israel, and the non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, or the left, is a tiny and despised minority that has very little influence in the country. So nobody should be under any illusion that Israel can reform itself and voluntarily agree to any kind of just settlement with the Palestinians, whether equal citizenship or two states or anything. It's not happening within Israel. To the degree any of that will happen, it will have to be from external pressure, from things like BDS and changing U.S. policy that supports and underlines Israel's power in the region. That's the way it'll have to be. Israel cannot be reformed in a way like apartheid South Africa, which ultimately gave in under very, very powerful international pressure. And by the way, if anyone has any doubts that Israel is an apartheid state, it's a settler colonial state, obviously, but that it's an apartheid state, if that concept has any meaning at all, it's hard not to consider Israel an apartheid state. Apartheid has been codified in international law, not just specifically the South African version, but a kind of system of racial subordination through political means of the state. And there's very little question that that's the system that exists in Israel today. And hopefully, as that description gets more traction, we'll see pressure, build up against Israel. But that's the only hope for change. Meanwhile, the Palestinians effectively are trying to survive in their various segmented communities and trying to figure out a way to resist more effectively also. They've been kind of paralyzed by the Oslo process and the Palestinian Authority, and nobody has really figured out how to organize an effective and large-scale resistance on the ground against the Israeli occupation or Israeli apartheid. But it seems to me inevitably that's going to happen. When and how, we don't know, but it will happen.
And one thing that you just mentioned, Jeff, was about the need for activists in this country to do something about it. That these policies might have to be changed from the outside, maybe by denying the military support that we unconditionally give to Israel, And Paul Shannon in the chat just reached out to me privately and asked me to plug our working groups. And he is so right to do that, because this is exactly how this is done, right? Activists need to get together and organize to demand that our government change policy. So I want to let you know that we do have a Palestine-Israel Working Group, and we also have a Middle East Working Group. And I can include in the follow-up email the ways to get involved, when our next meetings are. And I encourage you, if what Jeff has said in his talk tonight has moved you, think about getting more involved. And Massachusetts Peace Action is truly a grassroots organization. We'd love to have you in these groups, and your opinion's going to matter, and you're going to help us put on programs just like this, do lobbying, raise awareness, and really make the actual change that we need to see so desperately. So that's my plug.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, very true. I mean, obviously, we face a daunting challenge in the U.S. to change the politics with relation to Israel. Public opinion is already starting to trend, in our direction, but for a variety of reasons, it's very little reflected in sort of policy in Congress and the White House. And there are lots of reasons for that. The pro-Israel lobby has been very well organized for generations. It's extremely well funded. And in this electoral cycle, by the way, a really new departure, AIPAC and the Democratic Fund for Israel are spending millions and millions of dollars in the Democratic primaries to defeat the more progressive candidates who typically have a more progressive view on Israel. And, they're having some success. It's hard to win in a primary when somebody is spending millions of dollars on negative ads on you. And by the way, these organizations never talk about Israel, even though that's their interest. They want to defeat candidates that will question U.S. policy to Israel. But in their attack ads, Israel is never an issue. And the AIPAC funding is called the American Fund for Democracy, I think. And so they recognize that Israel is not a very popular, subject among Democrats. So they use smear tactics that have nothing to do with Israel to defeat progressive candidates. And this electoral cycle is something really unique. I mean, it's something we haven't seen before on that. And thankfully, those of us, I live in Ayanna Pressley's district, we have one of the foremost people in Congress who wants to hold Israel accountable. And one of only 5 votes, if I remember, maybe it was 7 votes, against an additional $1 billion to buy missiles for Israel that passed in Congress. So, we have a long way to go, but we have to recognize that the winds of public opinion in the Democratic Party are with us. And that counts for something.
Yeah, and I swear I'm going to get to the questions in the chat, but actually an advocate down in DC actually called me while you were making your presentation to talk about a vote that might be just like the one that you were just mentioning, except I think we have a chance to get a lot more votes on it. They're considering an amendment to demand an investigation into the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. This is something unlike many other votes that promote Palestinian rights, because Shireen Abu Akleh was also an American citizen and a journalist who was killed almost certainly by the Israeli military. So right now they are questioning whether that amendment will get a vote in the next couple of days. And this could be a real chance for a positive vote to get more people on the record kind of violence from the Israeli military. So I just wanted to plug that as well.
And by the way, she was a Christian Palestinian. Again, the whole way this is framed, it's somehow it's a religious war between the Jews and the Muslims, right? And of course, it never was that in particular. Palestinians are both Muslims and Christians, and many of the ones, particularly in the United States, the old immigration to the United States includes more Palestinian Christians than Muslims. So here's an example: an American citizen gets murdered by a foreign government, and the U.S. basically covers it up. No consequence at all. Imagine if that happened someplace else, a place where we didn't have an interest in defending the government. We would have bombed them already by now. I mean, if an American like that was killed in Syria, the missiles would be flying already against Syria.
Yeah, and we have some smart people in the chat, as you know, Jeff. But people are already saying, for us in Massachusetts, Jim McGovern, who's the chairman of the Rules Committee, is huge on this. I'm going to get that number for you, Haynes. But here is the phone number for the Congressional Switchboard. It's 202-224-3121. And as Pat is suggesting in the chat, call up and ask to be connected to Chairman of House Rules, Jim McGovern, and tell him that this bill needs a vote. Thank you. Those are the direct numbers. You don't even, Pat just put them in there and I'll include them in a follow-up. He needs to hear it. I just heard this from DC. Please mobilize your folks to call Jim McGovern on this. And thank you, Abby, for putting that the link to the actual amendment, right there in the chat. Because this is something
has been decent on this stuff in general, but cautious. Partly because he has one foot in the Democratic congressional leadership, so he's cautious in terms of rocking the boat there. But he's been pretty decent. Presley, of course, is the best by far in our state, and McGovern has been decent lately. Stephen Lynch has stepped up pretty frequently on signing letters and sponsoring bills on this stuff, which is a good development. And those are the only three that even sometimes do the right thing on Israel and Palestine in our state.
So, and we were quite surprised to see that that Congressman Lynch was an original co-sponsor of that amendment. And then I remembered that a dedicated group of activists actually went down to his office in Quincy and held a little demonstration. And I think it's no coincidence that out of the 12 people who were original co-sponsors of that amendment, Stephen Lynch was among them. So this is just another example that a small group of loud activists who say we care about this issue can have an influence. This is what members of Congress actually pay attention to.
Yeah. In Lynch's case, it was a little bit of pushing in on an open door. I've known him for many decades, actually, from the labor movement and other things. And he is one of the people in Congress that knows the score, so to speak, on Israel, but has been very cautious in taking public stands until recently. So this is a welcome, turnaround for him. And maybe it's because he's been in office for a long time and may be thinking about retiring. This is something that liberates members of Congress sometimes to speak what they know to be the truth.
Yep, and to give him credit, his representative in Quincy did come down and address the crowd and said that he was calling for an investigation, and then he was an original co-sponsor.
Yeah, right.
But we need to make sure it gets a vote. And from what I hear, Chairman McGovern is hearing it from the Democratic leadership. They're pushing back against this. So he has a decision to make, and we'd like him to hear from you.
If you all know, Nancy Pelosi is a fanatic Israel supporter. Really fanatic. And Joe Biden, for that matter, is also. Joe Biden decades ago called himself a proud Zionist, even though, of course, he's a Christian, but Catholic. So for some people in Congress, it's a matter of sort of covering their backs politically and from what they regard as a powerful force in politics. But some people are true believers, a minority, I think. But Pelosi and Biden are in that category of true believers, unfortunately. But Markey used to be too, and now he's, made some moves in a more progressive direction. So people can change.
Yeah, and people can be moved if they hear it enough from their constituents. So let them hear it. Is what I'm saying to all the people that are watching, and I will include information in this follow-up. So somebody asked in the chat, and I think it's a good question. Rosemary asks, with your views on Israel and how public you are about them, how the hell did you get into Israel, Jeff? Why'd they let you in?
I was very worried about it, and I took a number of precautions. One of which is that if someone is interested in traveling in the Middle East, if you write a letter to the State Department, you can get a second passport. In general, Israel doesn't stamp your passport when you go. They give you a little slip of paper on a separate piece of a visa. But if they refuse you entry or deport you, they do stamp your passport then, which in my case would have meant I couldn't go to Lebanon or Syria. So I had a backup passport. I had a second passport, which I didn't have to use, as it turned out. The other thing is I flew from Athens to Tel Aviv, Lid El Al Airlines for the first time in my entire life. This was a conscious choice to sort of be under the radar as best as I could. Maybe it worked. And being old doesn't hurt either, because they tend to profile young people more strictly than older people. So anyway, it turned out there was nothing really, and I was all prepared to be grilled when I got back to the United States because of having visited Syria, and that had happened to me in the past, and it was nothing, totally routine. So being an old person and sort of apparently harmless and tired, maybe that helps your profile, helps you from being profiled. So everything went very smoothly, and including getting into Syria, which, as I mentioned, it's just unheard of to get for an American to get a Syrian visa these days, unfortunately. But
yeah, and you mentioned that they were, that an American is a rare bird.
Yeah.
In Syria. But you also mentioned how you were received. Did that surprise you? Or when they asked you to step out of the car, what were you thinking, Jeff?
Well, he seemed to be friendly. I mean, it is amazing, as I wrote, some of you have seen, it's just very moving. Syrians are, and most Arabs everywhere, but I could say Syrians especially, are enormously hospitable and friendly. And I guess they understand that if an American is visiting their country, chances are he's not going to be an enemy. But it's still very touching. When you go through these checkpoints, I was in a car, and they'd say, you have to show your passport, or when they'd see you an American, they'd raise their eyebrows, not out of hostility, but just that, we haven't seen any Americans for years in Syria. And they always respond, welcome, which is just very moving. It's the one word in English that every Syrian knows. Every Syrian soldier, every Syrian policeman knows welcome. And when we were stopped by those guys on the way to Aleppo, it became very clear that, within a few seconds, that they were inviting us, as opposed to, grilling us. And it was very emotional. These were two soldiers who have lost people. By the way, they were Alawite soldiers from Tartus. And the Alawites are particularly targeted by the U.S. allies of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, targeted for extermination. And partly because of that, every Alawite family has lost numerous people in this war. And here I am coming from an enemy country, and they're treating me like a brother. I mean, it really brought me to tears, I have to say. Still, when I think about it, I get kind of emotional about it. So it's part of why I keep going back to the Middle East. I mean, there is this culture of welcoming and hospitality in the Arab world, which is 180 degrees opposite of what the stereotype is, right? We have this stereotype of violent, hostile Arabs. I mean, it's totally the opposite of the truth. And every time I go, I feel this sort of heartwarming welcome everywhere, except in Israel. The only place I fear to go in the Middle East is Israel. Fortunately, there was no incident at the border. There was in 2018, by the way, when I went with my daughter, they gave us a very, very hard time at the border. And it was touch and go whether we were going to be let in or not. So I was prepared, and as it turned out, it was an anticlimax.
Yeah, on that particularly, Jeff, we have a question from Lauren Gilbert in the chat. Says that some of us are planning on going to Palestine next year with Eyewitness Palestine. do you think we'll have a hard time going into Israel and the West Bank?
Some of you will, for sure, especially if you have people with Arab names as part of your group. But it's hard to know what the what the principles are and what the criteria are. It seems to be a little erratic as to how they apply it. Young people are definitely more harassed than older people. If you have, you should do the best you can to clear off shaky stuff from your phone and from your Facebook. I had Facebook, which I hardly ever used and hated. I basically deleted my Facebook account before I went on this trip. And so it's hard to predict. If you are going to another country after Israel, especially an Arab country, that business of getting a second passport is a good precaution. You have to pay for it. But if you're going on from Palestine to someplace else, and also I purposely flew to Israel from Athens. If they reject you, if you fly direct from the United States and they reject you, they can send you all the way back to the United States. So entering from a nearby country, at least in theory, the worst they can do is send you back there and you can continue your trip one way or another. So that's my best advice, but it's hard to predict what will happen. It depends on who's manning the security that day, and how much of a profile you have. I would have thought I had a big profile because I've written a lot over the years. On the other hand, I write as Jeff Klein, and my official name on my passport is Jeffrey Klein. And both names are very common, unless they know to search plus something else, they wouldn't find any dirt on me. So whether it came to that or not, I don't know. But take whatever precaution you can, and don't be careful what you bring and what you bring out. So.
Well, thanks for that advice. I think especially, it might cost a little extra to get that extra passport, but it sounds like that might make a big difference for you.
If you're going on from Israel to someplace else, in the Arab world in particular, it's worth it, I think. And like I say, it's not easily predictable what's going to happen. So people have to be prepared for some trouble at the border, and I was happy not to have it. I flew El Al, which normally I would not fly. I've never flown El Al before, but that was another attempt to be sort of ordinary. And coming in to Tel Aviv, which I know for years and years, I always come from Jordan over the Allenby Bridge, and that's suspect a little bit in its own. Very few non-Arabs travel that way. So I consciously decided to fly to Israel direct this time. So that's the best I can recommend, but there's no guarantee that you won't be given a lot of trouble at the border.
Yeah, well, thanks for those words of caution and advice. On the question of profiling, a couple of people in the chat did mention that, the way that you referred to certain groups like Sunnis was maybe a little broad brush. I wanted you to be able to respond to that. I've heard the same thing about Catholics and Protestants my whole life, but just if you wanted to respond to that, Jeff.
Well, so I'm obviously not a theologian or an expert, but broadly it seems to me, and of course, within the Sunnis and the Shia, they're all different levels of, religious observance. So my close friend in Syria was nominally a Sunni Muslim, but pretty secular. But among the highly religiously motivated Sunnis compared to the highly religiously motivated Shia, in my experience, the Shia tend to be more tolerant and easier going. And again, it has to do with their history as a minority in the Middle East that's been persecuted. Maybe it has something to do with their theology. I don't know. I can't say. But Hezbollah, for instance, does not have an ideology of imposing an Islamic State on Lebanon. They explicitly don't advocate that. So they advocate pluralism. And again, their history is as a minority. Whereas, the extremists from the Sunni community, the Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia, Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, they do advocate a kind of religious dictatorship where they can. So, and they also seem to be less tolerant in sort of casual social situations. You know, the extreme Sunnis. You know, people are harassed in the Shia neighborhoods in Lebanon and Beirut. Some women are covered, some are not. You know, and it's pretty easy going. In around a neighborhood that's inhabited by more strictly strict Sunni Muslims, that would be much more problematic. And of course, alcohol and hashish and so on would be punishable by death, according to some Sunni theologians. So that's my experience. I can't say, and in terms of culture, why I say Catholic and Protestant. So the extreme Sunni and the Wahhabi version of Saudi Arabia, they tend to be very, very strictly against saints, revering any human beings other than the Prophet Muhammad and God. Whereas the Shia have a more folky religion with saints, and they martyrs and icons in effect. So that's loosely, it seems to me, if you had to categorize them, the extreme Sunnis are, radical Lutherans, and the Shia tend to be, like Catholics, a little bit more diverse, a little bit more less strict in terms of monotheism and icons, so on.
Yeah, but we know there's probably some Mel Gibsons in there too, right? Who are the
probably not, but honestly, not in my experience.
Well, and this is about your observations from your trip.
Yeah. So I don't, I certainly am not a religious person of any variety, but that was not regarded as a big deal among the Shia that I was with primarily.
Now, you mentioned, and I wanted to get to a question on Lebanon that Paul just shared in the chat about the political upheaval in Lebanon. He asked if that upheaval is against law, and he also asked about any positive political movements in Lebanon right now.
So they just had an election, a parliamentary election in Lebanon, which changed very little. I mean, basically, there are two big political blocs in Lebanon. One of Hezbollah and its allies, the Amal Party, which is also Shia-based, and the Lebanese Patriot Party, which is Christian-based, that has been allied with Hezbollah. And on the other side, you have, right-wing parties, and then sometimes with the Druze Lebanese Socialist Party, which is not socialist, and so things are kind of split down the middle, and it didn't change much in this last parliamentary election. And part of the reason is because the electoral system in Lebanon is very, very peculiar. It's a kind of grafted on that each recognized religious or ethnic community has its own list and its own, votes only within its own community. So it's a very archaic and arcane system, and that progressives in Lebanon want to change to have a more one person, one vote system, including Hezbollah, by the way. That's their official position. They want to do away with this sectarian voting system. But as a result, the country has been paralyzed practically since its beginning, and of course went through a civil war of 15 years or so. So, and on top of that, the governments have been very corrupt. It turns out the banks were all running as a Ponzi scheme, and basically people lost all their money. And even though Lebanon is not a poor country, it's not as poor as lots of other countries in Asia. They've never been able to fix their electric system or their water system in Beirut. People have private electricity and private water in most places in Lebanon where people can afford it. So it's a kind of stateless state, and it has been for many years, and it's not clear where it's going. And of course, the U.S. Doesn't help matters much by it's constantly pressuring the Lebanese government to persecute Hezbollah, which Hezbollah is one of the 3 or 4 big political parties in Lebanon, but to the U.S. government, it's a terrorist organization. And they put a lot of pressure on the Lebanese establishment not to allow Hezbollah into the government if they can. And they try to try to finance the Lebanese army, which is much smaller and weaker than Hezbollah's militia. And so there's a lot of U.S. interference, a lot of corruption. It's hard to see where it's going to go. And of course, Lebanon depended a lot on trade with Syria, and Syria is suffering from U.S. sanctions, and the war has spilled over. There are lots of Syrian refugees in Lebanon now. And so the country is a mess in all kinds of ways. And the U.S. doesn't seem to be helping it to, reform at all. Their main interest there is to support Israel and keep Hezbollah, out of power. And that's not a recipe for reform, by excluding, a large community. That's not a recipe for reform. But
you talked about forms of pressure levied by the United States, and that gets me to another question in the chat about Syria and how Syria is doing under the weight of U.S. sanctions and military pressure right now, and whether there's aid coming to Syria from other parts of the world, and how Syria is holding up against the economic sanctions.
So, Syria, again, now that the major fighting has paused, people in Syria seem to be taking a deep breath for the first time in years, at least compared to my previous visits. The economic situation is still very bad, but, the minimum so far, bread is the main staple of, poor and middle-class Syrians. And so far, the government is able to provide effectively free bread. Every family, there are government-run bakeries, and every family can go every day and get a stack of flatbreads, like this, for 200 Lebanese Syrian pounds, which is nothing, which is 20 cents or something like that. But on the private markets, things are much less affordable. But people are surviving, and gas is very hard to come by, and of course electricity. One of the people I met in Aleppo were friends of a local Syrian American friend of mine, and they had a pretty prosperous business in Aleppo until before the war, and now they're pretty impoverished. For example, they led a sort of upper middle class life. Now they had to sell all their property to get medical care for their mother, who had cancer, and so there's a lot of that. And of course, a lot of people have left Syria. Those with the means and the incentive have left. So it's still a difficult situation. And as long as, especially since the U.S. continues to occupy some of the most productive parts of Syria, and refuses to lift the sanctions or allow development, it's a very difficult road ahead for them. Now, the Chinese and the Russians are investing some in Syria. And the Iranians obviously are also trading. The Syrians can get oil, even though if they had control over their own oil, Syria would be self-sufficient in oil. But they have to import it now, and they can import it from Iran. Sometimes the U.S. interdicts the Iranian tankers on their way to Syria. So it's a very tough situation. And again, if you're not in the relative privilege sector, like the hotels I stayed at had electricity. But elsewhere in the private sector, if you don't have your own generator, you have electricity for an hour or two a day. And after dark, it's dark. That's it. I mean, it's unimaginable from our point of view to go on like that. Some of us have had electrical blackouts for a period of time, but to go on for years like that is pretty astounding. So it's a very tough situation. And the sanctions, obviously, as they do everywhere, the sanctions hurt ordinary people and don't achieve their purported aims of regime change. Even if that were legitimate, that's not what they do. They make ordinary people suffer. And that's true in Syria. It's true in Venezuela and Cuba, wherever it is. It's a way of punishing people for them having a government that is not considered friendly by the United States. And it's criminal. It's really cruel. And it's a crime. It's horrible, that we can do that.
And our own government has found through investigations that's exactly what these economic sanctions do.
Yeah.
they lead to economic destruction, and it's poor and working people that pay the price. And it does affect things like food and medicine, no matter what carve-outs they say are in those sanctions. It just isn't so.
So a lot of Syrians, not all, but some Syrians have access to remittances from abroad. That is, really helpful from Europe or America. People do help out, but the ones who have none of that are really, barely surviving. And it's a struggle, basically eat bread, bread and tea is, what a lot of people eat to survive. So, and, Syria is a very, an unequal place, not, like most of the world. So some people have a lot or relatively a lot, and some people have very little. And it's not an ideal society by any means, but the sanctions make things worse for the majority of people, not better. And of course, it doesn't have anything to do with democracy, right? I mean, I don't think anyone on this call will, has any illusions. The Syrian government is not democratic, wasn't democratic, but wasn't particularly worse than the government of Egypt, and probably not as bad as the government of Saudi Arabia, which is, a close U.S. ally for generations. So whatever the U.S. is doing in Syria, it doesn't have anything to do with democracy. whatever its aims are in Syria. And of course, the U.S. supports Israel, which, is a democracy if you're Jewish and an apartheid state if you're not Jewish. So the U.S. is not about democracy. And of course, Biden is on his way to Saudi Arabia after Israel, make whatever deal, who knows what kind of deal. So, unfortunately, most Americans, some of us here on this call care about these. Most Americans are not very well informed about this stuff, and intentionally, it's hard to get informed about stuff that goes against the grain. So, we need to continue doing educational stuff and mobilizing people, but it's an uphill battle. You won't find 1 in 1,000 Americans that knows we have troops in Syria, for example. How many people know that?
These are the issues that we work on here at Massachusetts Peace Action. So for those of you who are listening, who this might be your first time on a webinar, I invite you to join us, become a member. We're truly live grassroots values, so you can have an impact. Your voice will be heard. And I'm seeing it in the chat. I'm getting messages from DC. People are saying the same thing that Pat is saying. We need to mobilize ourselves right now and call Jim McGovern, who's the chair of rules. And Pat is quite right. I'm hearing the same thing on the phone from DC right now, that he needs to hear about this before noon tomorrow. So I promise I didn't plan to do this. But if it's okay with you, Jeff, I think I'm going to make a phone call right now and encourage everybody else on this call to do so as well. I've heard not taking phone calls to do it.
Maybe explain a little bit what the this is that you want people to do with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we talked about it a little before, but you're right. A reminder's in order. So a Palestinian American journalist was killed, likely by the Israeli military, almost certainly. And there have been calls for the FBI, for the US government to investigate this and investigate specifically whether there was any US equipment that was used in this case, because that's going to trigger some laws that we have on the books, including the Leahy law, that says that the United States cannot be supporting human rights abuses, or aid needs to be stopped. So there's an amendment that's going to be considered, whether it will get a vote or not, by tomorrow. The Rules Committee is meeting. And there's been a lot of pressure, just like Jeff was saying, from Democratic leadership. They don't want to have to be put on the spot here. But this is an American citizen that we're talking about that was murdered, likely by the Israeli military, and it needs to be investigated. If we're going to have any claim, if the Biden administration is going to have any claim, and Haynes, yeah, you're right, likely assassinated, not just killed. But if the Biden administration is going to have any claim that they support the rights of journalists, American citizens, this is an American citizen that we're talking about, then this needs to be investigated. So they need to hear about it like in the next 15 hours. So I'm going to put the number up that was shared by Pat and Abby and some others. 202-225-6101. Just let them know that you want this investigated. It doesn't take too many calls from people to register with them, and it's really not that difficult to do it. They're asking me to leave a message. Hi, this is Brian calling. I'm calling Chairman McGovern specifically because I know an amendment is being considered to the big military policy bill that's coming up. This amendment, introduced by Andre Carson, would demand an investigation into the murder of an American Palestinian journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. And just the rights of journalists are so important right now. And we really need our government standing up for American journalists, no matter where they are. So I encourage you, please, to use all your power to make sure that this gets a vote. I would like to know where every member of Congress stands on the murder of an American journalist. So I appreciate anything that you can do, and thank you for your work. I mean, it's that easy. It's not that tough.
You and thanks to everybody who stuck around long. I just had a chance to scroll through the chats, and if I offended anybody with my sort of back of the matchbook description of Shia and Sunni Islam, I apologize. That's just my experience, and I don't claim to be an expert in that or a theologian. But so other people may have other experience, and not to imply that every Sunni Muslim is intolerant or that every Shia Muslim is tolerant, but those seem to be the tendencies among the sort of pious in both camps. And of course, there are progressive Lutherans as well as progressive Catholics. So these are cultural norms but not universal, obviously. So
yeah, Jeff, and this was billed as your observations from the Middle East. But we want to address people's questions in the chat. Don't shy questions.
I can notice that. So anyway, if there's anything else you want to add, Brian, or any other burning question, I guess we can wrap it up.
Yeah, just that I think there's 80 of us on this call, and I think it was almost, I don't particularly believe in fate. When somebody calls me during a webinar saying we need people to make phone calls, and I'm talking to 80 people who care about Palestinian rights, I mean, that's an opportunity, and we can't waste it.
I agree. I'm still trying to get back in my in the mode of political action. I'm still struggling a little bit to get my normal sleep pattern, never mind my activist pattern. So I appreciate you inserting that.
Thanks for, I know you're not back to 100% after your long trip, but I want to thank you for doing it so quickly after you got back, when everything's so fresh in your mind.
I want to add one thing actually that I meant to say earlier. Well, two things actually. In the Middle East, including Israel, COVID is over, at least in terms of people's response to it. I mean, in Jerusalem, nobody wore masks in any setting whatsoever, both Jews and Muslims. And in Lebanon and Syria, zero on that. And so I don't know what that means, but that's been their practical situation. And whether there's going to be some huge new outbreak or not, I don't know. I didn't get COVID the whole time, and I was on buses and planes and cars unmasked. So there's that. And the other thing I wanted to mention was many of the people on this call are sort of engaged or trying to get informed about the situation in Ukraine and Russia and so on. And just to report, in the Middle East, the people that are around were either centrist, secular, or leftist. But with one exception, I met not a single person who basically bought the sort of U.S. NATO line on Russia and Ukraine. Not that necessarily supported Russia, but that they recognized the context of, the sort of singling out of Russia when the U.S. has been doing the same thing for a generation, and so people in the Middle East, like the global South in general, are kind of abstaining from this whole sort of pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia campaign that's going on in our press and in Western Europe and so on. It's not happening over there. People, for a variety of reasons, just don't buy it, which was true, illustrated by the UN votes also, that most of Africa and Asia abstained from condemnation of Russia, the way it was framed by the U.S. and the UN. So that's just something to bear in mind. Again, we're so used to hearing, a certain point of view in this country and thinking that's the norm everywhere, and it certainly is not. Certainly is not. And by the way, the one exception who more or less gave the sort of U.S. pro-Ukraine point of view was a Jewish American leftist in Israel, long-term activist leftist, but who was, had his foot as an American. You know what I mean? He was in that sort of ideological camp, and I didn't meet a single Arab who was, figuratively or literally waving the Ukrainian flag, which is what goes on here in the United States and Western Europe. So just something to bear in mind. Politics, people have learned to have a very different view of the world in some places than we consider normal in this country, and that's an example of it.
Well, thanks for that observation as well, and that's why it's valuable to hear a direct report back from somebody who went over there. And I want to open that up too. I'll put my email right in the chat. If you're taking a trip to the Middle East and you want to give us a report back, reach out to us. Reach out to the Middle East Committee. Reach out to the Palestine-Israel Working Group. We need more people involved. We need more people taking action. And I'm going to be sending out information about that amendment, and I'll draw up a little script. I think we've been given an opportunity here. Jeff talked about that vote where only 9 people voted against the extra $1 billion for funding the Iron Dome. We got a heck of a lot more than 9 people to vote for this. And this could be a serious step forward if we can get this amendment voted on. So I want to thank the people who have already called. And for those of you who haven't, here's the number again. I'll send you a script. They need to hear it in the next 15 hours, and we can actually make a difference here. And thank you, Jeff. Thank you for your presence.
I see a lot of people stuck it out through all this time. So thank you for your patience, and I hope to write some of this down, especially about Lebanon. I have an article I've been working on about Lebanon, but thanks for your attention and your willingness to listen. And thank you, Brian, for organizing this. And the struggle continues, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone who hung in, make those calls. Let them hear it.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
All right.